So, good evening, everyone. This is Ramrai Naik. We are very pleased to see all of you once again joining with us at Pinnacle on this completely interesting webinar topic. Firstly, to all those who are joining with us for the first time and those who don't know what is Pinnacle, Pinnacle is basically a students' club founded in Goa University by the students that encourages debates and discussions on topics that matter. We are a 2-year-old club having held 15 discussions so far on campus and additionally 5 webinars ever since the pandemic began. We have always highlighted diverse range of topics and tried to give voice to any particular issue that a very student community feels that is important and that needs to be addressed at that point of time. This webinar is organized in association with Department of Political Science. And coming back to the topic, education is one thing that binds all of us, and today's discussion is on something which has the potential to ultimately transform our educational system as a whole. Ever since this new education policy was announced, we got multiple requests from many people saying that we should hold this kind of discussion. But because there were exams going on, we were initially a bit reluctant. However, this topic is still very much exciting that even the students wanted us to take it forward and did not want it any further to delay. This is one of those few policies which has received praises even from the harshest critics of the government. But it certainly does come with a caution on the part of implementation, and that is the big question. The good, the bad, and the unknown we can certainly debate. However, there is no denying that this policy certainly gives a whole new direction than what it was pursued earlier to our education. And what better time for this policy to arrive than the COVID-19 pandemic times, which has been the most disruptive times of our lives. The new education policy promises many things, at the same time has some of contentious issues which needs a better clarity. And to discuss those points, we have a distinguished panel led by Dr. Manisha Priyam as a special invitee and Kaustubh Naik as a lead discussant. Dr. Manisha Priyam is joining us all the way from New Delhi. She is educational policy expert, political analyst, researcher, and holds doctorate from London School of Economics and Political Science. She is also an associate professor in educational policy at National University for Educational Planning and Administration, New Delhi. Dr. Priyam has over 2 decades of experience of working with donors, policymakers, administrators, and stakeholders in policy formulations, implementations, and evaluations. She also writes for leading newspapers such as Indian Express, The Hindu, Mint, Outlook, Dainik Jagran, Amar Ujala, Prabhat Khabar, and Hindustan. Then we have Kaustubh Naik, a doctoral student from South Asian Studies at University of Pennsylvania, US. He has completed his MPhil in Theatre and Performance Studies from the School of Arts and Aesthetics from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He did his MA in Performance Studies from the School of Culture and Creative Expression, Ambedkar University, Delhi. He was awarded the D.D. Kosambi Junior Research Fellowship for the period of 2016 to 18 by the Directorate of Art and Culture, Government of Goa. Kaustubh also is an award-winning writer for a play called Avyahat, which was based on an English novel Spoke on the Will by Amita Kanekar. He has been occasionally writing on culture and politics and has been published in Caravan, First Post, Frontline, and others. Once again, we are extremely thankful to both the panelists for giving us their time and accepting our request to be part of this Pinnacle webinar. So I would now kindly request Dr. Manisha Priyam to open the discussion for us and outline her takeaways and reservations on this new education policy 2020. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I think this has been the most beautiful invite I've had in all of this lockdown period. And ever since a small nanoparticle called the virus scared human beings away so much that for an invisible nanoparticle, we've put ourselves in de facto jails, given up civil liberties, given up the civil rights that our freedom fighters struggled for in Goa especially. You are aware that the socialists led the struggle much later than the rest of India. And I can tell you with great confidence that while we read our history, our freedom struggle as a political struggle, a very important part of that struggle was led through the sphere of public universities, and that sphere was slightly different from the struggle that went on as a political struggle. So while Political leaders are our very celebrated leaders. I can tell you that in India's diversity, India's linguistic aspirations, India's as social aspirations in terms of social inequality found their best representation in the variety of forms in which, as we struggled with the British, we also struggled to create that sphere of the public university, which Rabindranath Tagore's evocative poetry, the first lines are, where the mind is without fear. So that is the, if any one of you pursue the sciences, you will understand that's the creation of the counterfactual. Creating that moment where the mind can think without fear. So the university is that sphere, which can do all of this. And today when we get together, I'm absolutely delighted that the student body at the University of Goa has taken this lead. After I've come back from the LSE, I've started working in higher education. And it surprises me to see that there is almost zilch literature in terms of the student body in public universities in India. There is almost null literature in terms of the diversity of our university systems and education policies. Even as they begin talking about schools, etc., they'll talk a lot about childhood. Moment they begin about the university system, they start saying, oh, the universities are so bad, they're not capable of excellence, they're not capable of quality. There can be a Kaustubh Naik who will walk from here to University of Pennsylvania, but the School of Arts and Aesthetics degree or his writing of poetry or of novels, etc., is not good enough to recognize a good product of an Indian public university. So there is something about it that creates in us that inferiority complex. If there is some people here from Jammu and Kashmir, anybody here in this group from Jammu and Kashmir? Like, do you know of anybody here in the chat box? Now, even in Jammu and Kashmir, for example, at the Chowk, there is a book publishing house. If you see, it's one of the most beautiful book publishing houses that I've ever seen, because the bookshelves have the Kashmiri filigree. And the books are written in the language that is used to express Kashmiri. There's also Sheikh Abdullah's biography selling in that bookshop, but it reads the other way. Now, if you go to the University of Mysore, for example, as much as the University of Mysore is famous, in the town people will tell you, oh, you are researching the University of Mysore, please go to Gita Book House. And Gita Book House on the main talk will tell you how the best of the university people came to the Gita Book House or to the coffee shop by the side, and how part of the university public sphere and debates were held extended in these bookshops and these coffee houses. So yes, although virtually, I am delighted to accept this invitation and to speak to you about the new education policy. I'm going to do just two things. One of the things that I'm going to do is to tell you about the nature of education policy in a couple of lines, so that you understand what the framework of trying to understand an education policy should be like. You all are, senior students, and you will understand that we need frames of understanding to be able to understand. You can read the policy document 5 times over, but you won't know how to interrogate it. You won't know how to analyze it. Most people will start writing, oh, this is privatization, this is marketization. Why are so many people praising it then? So how do we engage with it? How do we analyze it? Number one. Number two, what I'm going to do is present some tenets of the school education part, right? And then you will understand why the policy has such broad acceptance. And then I will present to you some of the key things that I think are there in the higher education part. And the last part will be that I will tell you what I think are the gaping holes in the policy, or where a critical engagement with the policy should be approached from, right? So let me begin from the first part. Now, any education policy document is a sort of a continuum. It doesn't disrupt old established orders. Even till date, the most innovative education policy in India has not been able to disrupt some of the colonial era institutional legacies with respect to public universities. For example, if you look at the fact that in colonial India, there was a definite approach that you keep technical education out of public universities, and you keep the public universities at a slightly low level. Keep the public universities only to do credentialism with respect to exams and give certificates which enable you to get government jobs. The emphasis on learning the language English, right? The technical education was kept outside the domain of the public university, and that is a British colonial era hangover. Now, one of the best publicly funded institution we made in independent India, and an institution that enjoys the best reputation, the Indian Institute of Technology. Now, that institution and its founding outside the system of the public university persisted with this colonial trend. There remains no reason why the IITs should be outside the public university system. Those of you who will go abroad, go to the US, you will find that some of the finest universities in the West, some of the finest universities in the US, at Berkeley, for example, the College of Engineering is not outside the university. It is a part of a public university. You have liberal arts, social sciences, you have humanities. So people who do poetry, people who do the sciences, people who do rocket science, people who do digital technology, people who do the languages, they all cohabit a sphere. So knowledge is a part of a critical sphere. Now, education policies, therefore, have a definite continuum. And education policy documents, their most significant aspect is that they tend to create a consensus. Now, while you may be at war with the state on other things, or you may have issues with the state, you may be critical of the state, the education policy document creates that moment when educationists collaborate with the state to implement a process of education. And why the term consensus is very important, now, and which is why I'm going to begin with the school sector. If you read my work, for example, done at the London School of Economics, I have devoted nearly a decade of my life trying to see how schools work at the local level in a variety of Indian states, but two of them in the PhD. Now, the core essential is that with near universalization of school education, almost every family in this country has agreed that their child should go through school education. Now, once that child goes through school education, they will go through all stages of education most likely, unless they don't find access or unless the economic costs are so high that they have to drop out. So universalization of school education is the most important phenomena that forms the premise to this new education policy, right? Now, somehow this universalization, states in the northern parts of India, states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, in 1990 they were referred to as the Bimaru states, right? Large population outside of schools. But these Bimaru states also, in the last 2 decades, there has been a rapid change. Even states like Bihar have closed the gap, and children who are outside the net of the school have gone through the schooling system. Now, therefore, you will find that the most important part, and strategically, the reason why this policy has received a large amount of acceptance in the country, first of all, has been with respect to what it has said in school education. Because already there is a premise of, it's not coming tabula rasa. It's not as if this government is the one that has created the premise for all this. All prior governments have worked this path towards universalization. And universalization doesn't mean everybody comes. It means that various states in India have gone back to the ground and said, why is it that the poorest, the weakest, the girl, the scheduled caste, the scheduled tribe are unable to come to school? Therefore, in bringing children to school, the plurality of Indian states, which is called federalism in the language of Professor Rahul or the language that I am trained in, the plurality of Indian states have somehow approached the social inequality in their society. And they have said, okay, we will make provisions by way of which the scheduled caste, the scheduled tribe, the girl child, the left behind, the out of school, we will bring them to school and we will keep them here. immense advances have been made, especially by 1995, the midday meal school became a turning point, and massive enrollment increases and a lot of increase of central funding led to large-scale school enrollments. Now you will find that this policy talks about the school section in large detail. And one of the most important things it does is that it talks about a 15-year cycle, 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4, right? Earlier we had what you know already, a 10 plus 2 system. Now, can you reflect and tell me what a 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 and what a 10 plus 2 means? 10 plus 2 you knew, 10 years of school, then 2 years of senior school, and then go to college. Now, what does this mean? 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4, 10 plus 2. 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 means 15 years. 10 plus 2 means 12 years. Does this mean this government has done a lot? What does this mean? One guess. Any one of you unmute yourself and speak. What does this mean?
Yes, ma'am, if I may.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
So I think what they've done is they've created these checkpoints at which if a person cannot continue studying for all the 10 standards, he can stop at these checkpoints and then continue and get to the mainstream back again if their conditions or situations, don't permit them to do the 10 standards continuously. So I think that's what they're going to break down all these things.
Okay, so let me tell you one thing, that this whole idea about age-based, grade-based and stage-based learning is an idea that is as old as the Pythagorean theorem. It's an idea that has been discussed by human society since 5th century BC. For example, Plato's Republic talks about the fact that in the young years, we need the training of the body. Gymnastics will do training of the body. Music will do training of the mind. What do we talk about today? Playway method for youngsters. Now, similarly, then it advances saying mathematics is also training of the mind. It leads to higher levels of abstraction. So human society, for example, if what we do in colleges today deal with higher levels of abstraction, many of us feel our school children cannot deal with it. But the fact is, school children are also exposed to abstraction. In grade 8, we teach students pi, 22 by 7. Is 22 by 7 an abstraction or a concrete idea? It is an abstraction. 22 by 7 doesn't exist in reality. 22 by 7 is only a form of approximation. So what this 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 system has done is that it brings in school system as a 15-year process. If 10 plus 2 was 12 years and this is 15 years, the additional 3 years has come because of a reason. What is this additional 3 years because of? This additional 3 years has come because early childhood has been added, right? Early childhood stage has been added. What was this early childhood stage? Children in the age group 0 to 3. And why am I telling you about this? You will understand, therefore, that these children in the 0 to 3 year age group, they were not in the school system. Okay, somebody's written it's not an abstraction. It is an abstraction. Because if you iterate on the computer and you divide 22 by 7, at the nth iteration, you will find that the computer will stop giving you the fixed idea of division. So it is an abstraction. It's a ratio, yes, but it's an abstract because it doesn't exist in reality. It's a tangential idea. It's not something that you can perceive. 22 by 7, for example, the ratio is used to be able to introduce the idea of the circle to you. So it is an abstraction. The circle also does not exist in reality. Now I'll come back to this idea of the child. Now this child in the 0 to 3 age group has been added to the school cycle. Now this child, in reality, the 0 to 3 age group, was only a scheme for the government until now. And while the children above this age group studied in class 1, 2, 3, 4, they were fed midday meal in schools. These young children, very often in rural parts of India, this school group actually 0 to 3 year age group, ICDS children, they sit on verandas of schools. You understand? So the ICDS center works out of a school veranda. The elder children will have a school meal. The elder children will have, they will get proper teachers. And children studying in the ICDS section just have one Anganwadi worker to deal with them. And they only have some nutritional supplement being given under ICDS. So they find that these elder children are eating good meals, they are being educated well. On the same campus, the young children have to sit on a veranda. A lot of educational research has been pointing out that early learning is an important input into the cognitive advancement of learning. Not only that, even the languages, as far as they are concerned, children who are in the 0 to 3 age group are very advanced learners of the language. Right? They are very advanced learners of the language. Cognitive learning is at a very high level. So what this 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 system has done is that it has brought in children who were covered under a scheme of the government into the school of the government. So this is a huge advance from being covered only to be given some nutritional supplement, to be given the full midday meal, and to be sitting only on the veranda, to be covered only under a scheme of the government, to be covered under the care of the government. Now, whether we like it or not, a full school in India today has at least 2 rooms. That's largely the Operation Blackboard that was once started. It has a chalk, it has teachers, and much advances have been made, right? Now, those advances are being consolidated by expanding this range. Now, lots of other things in the school education sector. One, the policy which had been taken out by Kasturirangan had said para teachers will be discontinued. But the NEP document, I find, is not saying much on that, right? But the most spoken about section in the school education sector has been the issue of the language formula, saying that you can do 3 languages, etc. Even earlier, when it was said Hindi will be introduced, when the NEP document draft had come out, then southern states had raised their objection. Now, even now, when the 3 language announcement was made, Tamil Nadu immediately reacted and they said, look, for us, Tamil is important, English is important, Hindi is not. Immediately, therefore, you realize that language-based diversity of Indian states is a very important issue of dissonance. This consensus is put apart when we approach the issue of language. So, for all its diversity, for all our colonial masters trying their tricks on us, for all of us adopting English, we have no, as literate Indians, we have no real problem with the English language or a lot of the culture that we associate with our British or Portuguese colonizers, but our language and culture still survives. I don't know how that happens. Maybe you people know that better than me, but it still survives. Now, I will give you here an example, and that will tell you that the Indian Public University has survived because of its being embedded in a public sphere. Now, in Karnataka, for example, I find the Karnataka Sociological Association translates some of the best works in sociology. Tony Giddens' works, translated in Kannada. Because what is happening is, with massification in the public university, a lot of the students who are coming from farming backgrounds, from disadvantaged social backgrounds, a lot of these students talk only Kannada. The affirmative action policies, for example. This means that a lot of our students are learners in the language in which they have been born and socialized. I myself, till grade 3, I had never seen an English medium school. I used to live with my grandmother in a village. And my mother believed that, she likes reading and writing. If I don't bring her to an English school, she will not be able to make it in life. And I still remember the horror of, being unable to deal with English as a language. There would be days on end when I would not open my mouth because of the language coming to me which I didn't understand. Even today, my best expression remains when I'm allowed to. I can still, I can speak English and Hindi very well, but I can sing only in Bhojpuri. I'm unable to sing English or Hindi songs. It doesn't come to me. The Bhojpuri comes to me. Now, when I start singing in Bhojpuri, a lot of my urban friends tell me, oh, don't do that. All these laborers by your side, they are all from Bihar. They will hear your language, and this distinction between us and the labor will decline. So, where for me does the public sphere lie? The public sphere lies in the unity of mind with my language. And despite so much of acquiring of knowledge, I can write critical papers, I can do many things, but I remain an incomplete entrant into the public sphere as a full sphere, where I could read, write, plays. My songs are all in Bhojpuri. I wait for weddings. You know why? Because I write a lot. I write in English, I write in Hindi. The weddings in my family are the only occasion when I can sing in my own language. So I think the public sphere is a very integral element of the higher education sphere. Now, once I introduce the public sphere and criticality, let's review what this NAP is saying in the sphere of higher education. Now, it is saying they will replace multiple regulators with one. UGC, AICTE, Higher Education Commission of India will replace them. Nursing Council of India, Medical Council of India, Architectural Council of India. Now, this part of the suggestion is really a governance framework suggestion. The ordinary, quotidian, everyday life of the university has little to do with the fact that the public university is being funded by the UGC or the AICTE, the the Nursing Council or Medical Council or the Architectural Council or many other duplicate bodies. The government's suggestion is that replacing multiple bodies by one regulator will lead to uniformity, right? Now, there could have been an alternate suggestion from the policy perspective. And what could have been that alternate suggestion? That alternate suggestion could have been that we will have one regulator, but different in different states. Decentralization, right? So yes, removing the multiple bodies is good, but has this governance change approximated the idea of the public sphere in which the university exists? No. When the Goa University faculty comes to NUPA, I could see some faces here that I meet in NUPA seminars. They come here only give us figures on, oh, enrollment is so much, access is so much. This diversity that I'm seeing on the screen today, of knowledge, of culture, and that I would have seen even more had I been with you on campus. This diversity of the public sphere is what needs to be recreated if higher education through the public university system is to be made robust and has to be competitive with global standards. Why should the best Hindi poetry today not come out of the Allahabad University? The last poet laureate of the university system in the Hindi public sphere has been a lady called Mahadevi Verma. She taught at the Allahabad University. When I read her poetry, I find she's tinkering with notions of time. Whether time is a linear variable or time should be seen with dimensions. And it reminds me of my lectures at the London School of Economics, where a lot of anthropologists, Maurice Bloch and others, would dialogue with economists on the nature of time. For economists, time is only a T1, T2, T3, T4. Time is a lapsed variable. Have you seen graphs on XY axis? 93, 94, 95, 96. What is this a connoter of? Lapsed variable. 93 is in the past. After that, 94 comes. 94 is in the past. After that, 95 comes. Does time have a vector or a dimension of its own? If you read people like anthropologists like Arjun Appadurai, they will tell you that This is a flat expression of human experience. And Arjun Appadurai writes that we need to uncover space and voice. Otherwise, this XY axis suppresses social sciences as if human experience does not matter. Right? Now, having made these points, very good to merge the UGC, AICTE, this regulator, that regulator. But has it led to approximate the diversity of the public university system in India? Stop short. Then it also says that single stream higher education institutions should be replaced by those with the multiple streams. Basically, it upholds the idea of the liberal public university where liberal arts and humanities are at the center and professional and technical social sciences at the periphery, so that one campus can have arts, social sciences, this, that, etc. Right? I ask the practical question to this. This is a very noble and laudable aim of this policy, because this reverses this colonial era dichotomy of liberal education as only utilitarian, giving exams and credentialism, and technical education being taught outside. Technical education teaching outside had led to a legitimacy of Brahmanical forms of knowledge, had led to an in technical, and I'm not saying this, you can read up writings by Fuller and Narasimham, you can read up writings by Amrit Srinivasan, you can read up writings by Ajanta Subramaniam, and these will tell you, also by John Harris, my supervisor at the London School of Economics, these writings will tell you that upper caste gained an advantage because of this model of public university of the colonizers, where the public university existed only for utilitarian ends, exam, certification, and technical and professional education was kept outside it. Now, this statement of policy can become a reversal of that trend, and therefore the policy statement is to be welcome. What needs to be seen, however, is, do we have enough knowledge of the public university system in India which can argue with these policy intents? And as this policy intent is translated into practice, just by joining a technical education, an arts college, and nursing college, and saying, oh, these five are together now, will it become a public university? Will it become a public university? No. Kaustubh is going to an American public university, and he will find that in the parking lot of a large public university, they will have a section reserved saying this section is reserved for Nobel laureates. An undergraduate student can have a class with a Nobel laureate. An undergraduate student can become a part of a tinkering lab. When I studied at the LSE didn't have a campus as beautiful as the University of Goa. The campus I love that you have, large place. The London School of Economics was a bookstore given to Fabian socialists, who were then advancing the cause of equality and socialism in Britain. But what is different between there and here is just one issue which is greatly different. When I studied methodology, the best epidemiologists, the best philosophers of science were teaching us before we ultimately wrote a thesis in the social sciences. So this distinction of the Brahman and the non-Brahman, anybody who's studying arts is a lower science, both IITian scientist. Do you know that the IIT's reputation is largely what is called in the language of education policy that of private economic returns? The great reputation of the IIT is because of their entrance exam being tough. The students study only undergraduate and they get high paying salaries in the job market. Following globalization and liberalization, the middle classes of India put high premium on these kind of jobs, especially with the booming of the service sector industry. Right? If my son goes to IIT and gets a job in the Silicon Valley, this is moksha for me. This is nirvana for me. This is swarga for me. The child with a dream in their eye, the child with the poetry on their lip, the woman with a song in a Bhojpuri in her throat, My parents gave their entire lives as working professionals to make sure that the song in Bhojpuri remained in my throat. And therefore my eyes, ears, hands, all do English critical learning, and I'm a part of some globalized knowledge atmosphere where I'm called a good academic. I have many citations, I have many this. What happened to my poetry? What happened to my embeddedness? What happened to my culture? My daughter asked me today, what do you want to do at the end of your life? I said, Vishita, let me finish my job. I really want to go back to my village now. I will take all my books. I just want to go and stay there. And that which I left behind, because of the pressures of education being separate from the public sphere, the stigma that no parent wants that their child study the liberal arts and become a poet, become an IITian. Do what you do as an IITian, which was the penicillin invented by IITians? Are the IITians working on the vaccine for coronavirus? It's still being done in university labs, the Oxford University lab. But when the IITian walks next to us, we have to say, oh, he's very smart, come through IIT. Right? So I would take this policy statement and say, oh, this policy statement is really good. This means a reversal of colonial era dualisms. But because of my prior knowledge of the university, the public sphere, and the localism of universities around the world, I will engage with the policy statement from the point of view of critical knowledge in the area. Okay? Opening up Indian higher education to foreign players. This is the policy statement. Let me give you one example. That when the Maharaja of Mysore decided that the best way to counter the British aims, which were bad and perverse in the princely state of Mysore, was to set up a public university. He sent his emissaries, Thomas Denham and C.R. Reddy, to study how University of Chicago, University of Oxford, and the University of Melbourne worked. In the 1930s, this mission had gone. It was in this university, in the Maharaja College, Mysore, that Dr. Radhakrishnan delivered his class lectures that became a treatise on Indian philosophy published by a London publisher. It was in this university that a man called M.N. Srinivas studied, who later set the foundations of M.N. Srinivas later set the foundations of sociology in India. Right? So the big point is, in fact, the JNU, where Kaustubh, you have been at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, my senior colleague at the NUPA is a JNU Economics Department PhD. The JNU had a system of sending their PhD thesis abroad. One of his examiners was in Cambridge, and it was checked. Right? So this opening up existed. Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore's idea to set up a university. How does it happen? Gurudev was stimulated by ideas of the public universities and the public intellectuals he saw in Germany. This was the pre-Hitler Germany. These were the universities where Kant, Heidegger, Weber, they were studying. And Weber was writing his best pieces on what he thought was the professionalism of the academic in the public university. The public intellectual lost. The public university was attacked. But the fact is that Gurudev's idea of a university global in outlook was nothing short of an open idea about Indian higher education. at your university, the University of Goa, I have heard the best band playing ever in any Indian university, and I can say in many others abroad. And you had a Brazilian gentleman who was helping the band play, the orchestra play. The most creative music was to be heard here. The Banaras Hindu University filled play of academics from outside. So what happened? This opening up is not a new thing that we will become foreign or foreign will come to India. Why will foreign come to India? When at the scale of a nanoparticle, the first thing foreign has done is to close foreign to Indians and telling you do distance more. What will come of the foreign to India? Can you tell me? So my first plea is yes, universities should open up. Universities should open up to faculties from here and there. It would be so good to have faculties from all over the world in residence on our campus. It would be so good for me to get an invite to teach on your campus for even 2 months. A lot of the learning happens by co-location. And do you think the teacher is a final point in the sphere of knowledge? No. Academics in the higher education sphere co-learn with their students. Newman's idea, the Humboldtian idea, is of locating the academic in the university so that we co-learn with our students. The idea of higher education is not a place where people with immense learning can be put as statues and students have no role. No, we co-learn with students. And why is this platform not such a good platform? Because it limits my opportunities for co-learning. So the policy says open up Indian higher education to foreign players. I say policy statement to be welcome, but caveat is Indian higher education was not a very close phenomenon. This closure has happened only for a decade and a half. I would say late 70s, 80s and 90s, the worst decades, when these universities became provincial, insular. It's a good reversal. But my question would be what in the name of foreign? My question would be, how do we still respond to our diversity? How do we still respond to the plural public sphere that is articulated through our universities? And how do we showcase? Does all of India know the kind of band the University of Goa has? No. I was lucky enough to be invited thrice over for another conference that the University of Goa was co-hosting with the International Center Goa. And I got to see your university. If we don't even have the money to travel and see our own universities and meet our own students, I think the real question would be that the best intentions will fall short of realization. So I would say on intentions, I'm okay with one regulator, but I think it falls short of the federal diversity of the public sphere. I would say very good that single stream will be phased out. My question would be, will it end the colonial era dualism? Will you set up the for real liberal public university? My question would be that. My third one would be opening up higher education to foreign players. These are not players. Get us academics, get us college professionals. Can you bring a Nobel laureate, a scientist to the University of Delhi or to JNU and house them for a year? Can you get 10 Nobel laureates? Can you get undergraduate students to study in their classes? Do I have the liberty to study poetry along with physics? Policy says yes. Realization will be very difficult. Very difficult. Can I write my poetry in Bhojpuri? Can I speak? If I were a Bhojpuri intellectual, would today I have this invite from the University of Goa? Now, there are many spheres where regional languages became the route to nationalism. The Malayali nationalism, for example. and they combined their university and intellectualism along with the public sphere. The Malayali nationalists, for example, imported the printing press, and print technology became the route to challenge the corruption, inegalitarianism in society, corruption of British rule, even of Travancore Raja. A newspaper called Swadesha Bhimani led a tirade, and we have read up articles of the Swadesha Bhimani between 1905 and 1910. Numerous articles are paying such attention on the sphere of education, saying exams, these were the problems, this director of public instruction, wrong posting, school education is suffering for XYZ reasons. So, immense focus on how education should be done, an immense focus on translation of the best works in Malayali. Similarly, in the Marathi public sphere, I don't have a picture right now, but I was at the University of Kolhapur last year, and I was shown by faculty that they have a Marathi translated version of Bhagat Singh's essay written in intermediate stage. And that essay, Shaheed Bhagat Singh's essay is about Bhasha आणि लिपीचे समस्या, Punjabi Bhasha आणि लिपीचे समस्या. Bhagat Singh is writing about the problems or difficulties in Punjabi as a language and as a script, and those have been translated in the Marathi public sphere. The Nashik colleges invite me in research methodology classes. Anything that I have to speak, they translate in Marathi immediately. So that's the real world of the university. N number, Latur, Bid, Nanded, lecturers will come. Take a bus at 4 o'clock. Come for a seminar through the day. एक टाइम का खाना खा के शाम को बस लेके वापस जाते हैं. ये है पब्लिक इंटेलेक्चुअलिज्म हमारा. तो जो this feeling that we've got, oh, foreigners are not here enough, our public university is very, no. We are ordinary poor people. Our universities are in poor shape, but we need to understand how we need to revive our universities in a plural public sphere first. We are not on the world map of world-class university. We are not first on ranking, we are not second on ranking, we will never become one. And I don't have a problem, because one of the books that I'm just finishing the editing of, a former IIT professor writes that none of the IITs are in the top 10 or 50 of any of the world rankings. None of our IITs. They come in the top 200 of one ranking. None of them come on the top 200 of the Potticherry Simmons. They come. In Times Higher Education, they don't come. Why? So much public funding. Such great private reputation as a brand. And therefore, I'm telling you that the university never was and never will become a brand. Don't worry. The university's best survival will still remain in the university's capacity to ask a critical question. And here I think the suggestions of the new education policy about 4-year multidisciplinary, 2-3 things. One is the liberal university, liberal arts and social sciences at the center, 4-year multidisciplinarity, exit points, etc. I think are very valuable suggestions. Now, every education policy represents a consensus. If you see, these ideas seem very close to the idea of public sphere that I am talking about, right? But if the implementation happens in a manner in which bureaucratization becomes the hallmark, and therefore policy studies devote a lot of energy on what there is an area called implementation study. Policies can remain shiny documents unless we look at how the policy is implemented in its quotidian, everyday institutional form. An important anthropologist called Britty Lukos at the New York University is arguing for precisely this. Don't see reforms in the eye, abstract. See how they are implemented in grounded ways. In Latur, Nanded, Bid, Kasargod, Asaram, Delhi University, JNU, great. Jamia also great. But how it is implemented in its everyday quotidian form. Now the chances that higher education could become a sector by the single regulator, right? Ministry-led strategy. Now, if it becomes a sector, then it will become a bankable sector. If it becomes a bankable sector, then there are great chances that the state will withdraw funding and it will ask the market to co-provide the funding for this sector. Now, if that happens, then clearly there will be those who believe that higher education must be largely publicly funded, and there will be question marks. The issue really is that the South African experience tells us that trying to fund higher education through fees and through loans has not worked in post-colonial societies where children come from disadvantaged social backgrounds. So, in comparative social sciences, the question that I would ask of this policy is, should the relevant comparator for India be America or South Africa? What is your answer? What is your answer? Should the relevant comparator for us be South Africa or India? Now, okay, Priya Gupta is saying South Africa, Manjunath is saying America. Let me give you the America answer. Orson feels none. So, great. Sushant also feels none. Great. Now, if the relevant comparator is America, let me tell you that in America in the 1960s, when what is called massification, in school education I told you about universalization. In higher education, massification is a phenomenon where members of the working class, members of colored, race backgrounds are able to enter the elite fold of the university. Now, India is at that transition stage where our higher education enrollments are becoming high, which means children from non-elite backgrounds are making it to public universities, right? Now, at this point, when children from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds, non-elite backgrounds, who have been through this universalization of schooling from the 1990s onwards, when they are entering the portals of higher education, that cannot be the time that we ask them to take loans and study in college, right? We have to have more mechanisms of public funding. And I will close quickly now. Yeah. Time?
Yeah. A polite interruption. Yeah, kindly limit yourself.
I'm concluding.
Opening remarks in 4 minutes.
Yeah, I'm concluding this now.
So we can take.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can take more questions.
Yeah. So I'm concluding this by telling you two things. That the University of Mysore, for example, it became great not because the king came to class, but it became great because the king attended the same class as the ordinary plebeian laborers did. I have interviewed students from the University of Mysore who are in their 80s and 90s, and they said, except for the fact that a special wooden chair was put at the end of the classroom, there was nothing special that was done for the king when he attended those classes. But the more important part was that there were several scholarships, several philanthropies that were helping children and even girls from farming, agriculture, even agriculture labor background to study through the public university. And even by the 1960s, many of these students, through these scholarships of the government and of philanthropy, they were able to do their PhDs even in institutions like Harvard. And India's first full woman Dalit professor was taught on a similar scholarship at the University of Mysore. She was the daughter of an agricultural laborer. She couldn't have studied there if the public funding of the university had not been in place. So the big question would be whether there's centralization, whether there's bureaucratization, whether there's criticality in the public sphere, whether federalism and diversity happens or not. So we have to understand that the policy will have questions as it is implemented. So I'll just leave it here and take the questions.
Thank you, ma'am, for your very lucid presentation while touching a very wide array of issues. You also gave us very different kinds of alternative perspectives, and then your special emphasis was on universalization. You also gave us some landmark achievements of the past, plus that some of the questions that we received in the registration are already answered by you. So then, going back to our late discussant, Kaustubh, you wrote on your social media profiles that you'll be dealing with this, much controversial topic in our state, that is medium of instruction. And more often than not, the things you always post on your social media, sometimes somehow they create buzz. And because this policy and how it dealt with the MOI issue has made some Goans happy, whereas others not so much. Therefore, we are very curious to hear from you what you have to say about it. I now invite you to make your opening remark, Kaustubh. Yeah.
Hi. I mean, I don't know if I can match the breadth and the scope in which Dr. Priyam has sort of addressed the topic. I have some very brief points to make, and one is a section is of general comments on the policy as I see it, and another section on regional, the whole issue about medium of instruction in regional languages and what are the complexities of it. I'm not trying to sort of give one solution to. Yeah. So I mean, first of all, thanks to Pinnacle for having this, Ramrai and Dr. Tripathi and others. Because the spirit of public debate that one often finds lacking in Goa is sort of they're trying to sort of rejuvenate that that realm, and I guess that's a very welcome change. And it's an additional honor for me to do this discussion with Dr. Priyam here again, whose work on education policies is like something that we really is unparalleled, and the benefit of being in Delhi is, is that you get to listen to, I've listened to several of her lectures here and there. And also because she's from NIPA, and it was my father's much heralded dream until his death that he wanted to do his PhD from NIPA, but he couldn't.
Oh.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's some sort of a very personal connection with NIPA that I have. I'm speaking today as not somebody who learns policy or studies policy, but somebody who has been a student in higher education in last 5 years, 5-6 years. And I think that then as an important stakeholder of the policy that is going to come later, and somebody who's been in Delhi since 2014 at the turn of the regime that we have had, and for somebody, we have being in Delhi, being in JNU, and not just being in JNU, it's also before the UGC non-net fellowship movement. When I've seen the intersections of education policy, bureaucracy, and political establishment from some sort of a close distance. So I think that would be my sort of credence to speak at this gathering. First two impressions that I really had of the while reading the policy is that it just uses too many adjectives in sort of trying to prop up some sort of a promise that. And one thing I've thought of, that it does not really cite a lot of references for the claims that it is making. What it does actually is, keeping aside the hermeneutics of it, it's trying, just putting a lot of increasing the magnitude of expectation from the policy that people can have, rather than being very specific. It just props up a lot of expectations, and I don't know if it's a good thing, And second thing is, felt like, we are sort of doing away with the older colonial UK-based model of higher education and sort of favoring a certain US-based model. So this whole idea of scrapping affiliate colleges and the scrapping of MPhil. Having said that, much of the promise that the policy holds is a welcome change to the education system. But again, as everybody will tell you, the proof of the policy would lie in implementing it, and the implementation is not an uphill task only because of its scale, but also the inertia that a lot of present stakeholders in education implementation that have. So be it teachers, be it school management, be it bureaucracy, be it political establishment. Education is not somehow really driven some sort of political will. Am I audible, Ramran?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, it's a good policy. Good policy in the sense that I was discussing with a friend of mine, and she said it's a good policy because it could have been much worse than it is right now. So, in that sense, it's the promises that it is making about the whole a liberal public university or this whole doing away with streams is something that people have been wanting to wanting to see in our education policy for a very long time. So, but again, the catch here is that the policy does not really give a definite roadmap of implementation, and then also there are no measurable parameters of outcomes that one has to really so then, sans the roadmap or a certain measurable deliverables that the policy that fails to sort of mention in the text, it remains a lot of wishful thinking, I guess. But I really don't want to be cynical at this point right now. But there are some questions that needs to be raised. Second, I mean, this other point is of decentralization. I think ma'am has dealt it very well. This we have another national body, another accrediting body. While there is no necessarily any emphasis on decentralizing education, because as ma'am was saying, universities are also located in a certain specific context. And not just local context. I think there are pedagogical diversities also that one needs to be accounted. How, let's say, for example, how language is taught in one university may not be the same thing in a different university. And as I mean, like in US, for example, University of Chicago would have a very different methods of doing religious studies as opposed to University of Columbia. So these diversities, how do we sort of account for the not just the local and regional diversities, but diversities of pedagogy that that one has to sort of really think about. Also, the policy does not really state how the center is going to partner in sort of realizing this policy. So I think that is something that needs some more clarity, and I guess it's only time will tell us what happens on that. And coming back to one important point is that it's not like, again, like ma'am was saying, it's not that these experiments have not been done in India before, right? But I thought because this is giving out a model for a scale of a nation, I thought some success of these models could have been sort of mentioned in the policy. I'll be biased to start the model with JNU, but then again, we can't deny the kind of position that JNU has had in higher education. Similarly, a state university in Delhi that I went to, Ambedkar University in Delhi, which is also considered as one of the major multidisciplinary universities that have come up in last few years. And I think these models need to be studied in terms of them to be replicated. And I guess the policy should perhaps talk about these models. And again, and it's not just in last few years. There are success stories of a successful policy implementation. Goa, for example, I mean, when Bandodkar, the first chief minister of Goa, came to power, his emphasis was on setting up primary school across Goa. And that really revolutionized, the literacy rates in Goa to an extent that, a lot of you might have read Parag Parabo's book on Bandodkar's political.
Whose book?
Parag Parabo is a professor at Department of History at Goa.
Can you put it in the chat box?
Yeah, I will do that. It's called India's First Democratic Revolution. Where, among other things, Parag discusses how he compares Bandodkar's education policy with Nehru, for example, where Nehru emphasized on starting IITs and IIMs. Bandodkar was doing exactly opposite. He was just going to the most rural areas and starting schools, primary schools, to an extent that within the span of 10 years, the non-coastal belt in Goa had its literacy rate going from 18% to 51% within a span of a decade. So I think these models that really one needs to look at, because in terms of budgeting, in terms of prioritizing education, so I guess that could have been mentioned. And in exchange of this, though, we have some very mention of some ancient models of universities like Takshashila, Nalanda. I mean, it's not to say that these models don't matter, but I guess a more closer to history would be a good example. Like in ma'am's other talks that I was seeing, she was talking about the University of Mysore, or how BHU was this. These places were cosmopolitan much before we start now putting this whole entry of foreign players into a policy, and it's just that how do we then lessen the provincialism that our universities have sort of achieved over the last few years. And the last point and last general comment that I have about the policy is that in what environment is the policy is being realized, and because the devil is in the details. To put it very bluntly, in an environment where coming sites, how does one really realize the policy? And it's not just about JNU. And I was listening to one of the talks that ma'am gave, and it's there on YouTube, where she was talking about the Patna University case, where this disparity between hostel facilities has created some sort of a tension on the campus. So are other universities like FLU, HCU. A lot of bureaucracy, political establishment, sort of meddling with the university campuses. One is really skeptical of what will be the degree at which the sovereignty of the university will be sort of be given some importance. Then coming back to the crucial question of the medium of instruction. I wrote an article a few years ago while the Goan controversy around medium of instruction was going on. That we need to sort of unburden languages from this idea of motherhood that that we often ascribe them to. Because it often gives us a sense that languages are inherent or coded into our genes, and which is not the case. And I guess the education policy also talks about sort of facilitating multilingual education. But what we have in India is not actually a problem of only education, but I think education bears the brunt of it, is of how languages have been reduced as marker of regional identities.
Yeah.
How do we sort of reimagine that in the realm of education? Can we just leave that regional identity politics to the realm of some I don't know, some electoral politics, but not let education? Can we sort of not have education be bearing the weight of those claims? And you have the linguistic reorganization of states recognizes the diversity of Indian linguistic culture, but often it elbows out the linguistic multiplicity. So that is something that one needs to think. And then again, in Goa, the whole question is around the recognition of Rumi Konkani, the Konkani that has been in practice for a much longer period through the ages of the church, and it is mostly sort of practiced within the Goan Catholic community. That has not found any state recognition, and I think the demand that came for granting state funds for English medium schools was also one of the major fallouts of this of not recognizing Rumi Konkani as a legitimate language. I'll give you an example, and what happens with this standardization of languages. Let's say one sentence: how thoi gello, how thoi gello, how tinga gello, and niya thoi gello. These are three sentences which mean the same thing, but you see the vocabulary that is different here, the connotations that are different here. But it's only one of this sentence will be marked as correct or considered to be correct and standard, and other two would be not. So when we sort of say that we need to prefer regional language, or as a medium of instruction, we also need to understand the regional language itself are fraught with a lot of other complications of scripts, of dialects, of one language being dominant over other. And how do we then sort of, while thinking specific education, how do we account these problems in policy, one, in pedagogy, and then in assessment? Because that is what it matters. Because when this policy was being publicized in the press conference, one of this Goan person on Twitter made this tweet about how he used to write essays in his own dialect, but they were not being marked because they thought this is not the standard Konkani that one has to learn. And this is not and to be very frank, this is not a problem with Konkani alone. Across the country, you have these problems of dialects and scripts. There is a very dear friend called Kishore Darak, who's been working in Marathi education sector for a very long time now, and he was saying how the northern Maharashtrian people in, let's say, Gadchiroli and all these places, they find Marathi equally alienating to them, to an extent that they have a lot of local names for birds and whatever, but those names don't find reflection in the teaching content. So that really alienates people. And I guess a newer policy should rethink on this thing. I think there is an emphasis of creating this sort of local lexicons for languages. Yeah, and the other example, and I didn't know this, that Bhojpuri at some point had a script. I think Ma'am had mentioned in her talk at the Nehru Memorial that that there was a petition to sort of actively discourage writing in the Kaithi script that Bhojpuri had. So this whole linguistic, what do you say, the plane in which the whole language politics operates, it has a very adverse impact on education and on pedagogy. So I think we need to really sort of consider these points. And again, so the one sees English as this sort of a solution to this, because let's face it, English also has an aspirational value in a current, but it's also created because there are differentials in the power in which English has over other language. And if we really have to sort of address, or sort of do away with the, our fixation with English or whatever, then we need to empower other languages. Not to say that English is bad, but then you sort of bring other language and their knowledge systems on par with English. It's only then people probably will be convinced. So again, that, as I said, English has an aspirational value, and everybody should have the right to aspire. And I think government must provide the means to realize those aspirations, because the burden of conserving vernacular languages cannot be squarely placed on communities and class of people which can't afford privatized English education. So I guess in conditions in which this is not possible, I think. And again, the final point that I wanted to make is that learning in English and learning English are two different things. I mean, often in our sort of in our demand to have English as medium of instruction, we often forget that it's learning English has nothing to do with learning in English, and these are two separate things that one has to wonder. I'll give you my own example. I went to a Marathi medium primary school from my 1st to 4th. From 5th onwards, I went to a high school, which was an English medium school. And I could not speak in English until I went to my undergrads. And that is also because I went to a different city in Margao. And it is thanks to my Catholic friends, I got habituated into speaking into English. But and that apart, I also had access to a lot of literature. I had access to music. I had access to cinema, TV shows. That really helped me to sort of pick up English at some point, to an extent that I've been writing in English now in the last few years. Um, if you sort of strip away all these opportunities that I had, of my parents, both my parents were English teachers. So if you remove all this personal context, what remains is just the hurdle that that I can't access English in very many ways. And I guess if one has to really address the elephant in the room about English language learning, it is not just about making medium of instruction as English, but it's also about how creatively and how diversely you can teach English to students, and not just through textbook and whatever, but there are other means to be employed in English language education. And lastly, I mean, this is something that I also picked up from one of the talk that Dr. Priyam had, is language as a bridge to access some sort of a modernity. And that modernity, not necessarily a certain English, anglicized European modernity, but modernity of our own context also. Is it possible to think of, language policies sans the anxieties that the cultural nationalism is producing, or a certain post-colonial anxiety that is produced, as that we somehow sort of really isolate ourselves? No, I think if I learn Malayalam, for example, I have access to not only Malayalam literature, but also a treasure trove of translated Russian literature into Malayalam. So I guess we should also think languages not as some sort of standalone entities in their own, but as vehicles that take us to some different places, to some different cultures, and access and then become global in truly sense. Not just fixate with English, but access a certain horizontal, diverse modernity that that will probably make us a better citizen, in my opinion. And that's all from me at this point.
So,
Okay.
do I respond, Ramran, or more questions?
Yeah. So one question before going to the attendees, I would have one question with Kaustubh, because he's just done his MPhil, and because the new policy is talking about scrapping the MPhil entirely. Kaustubh, do you think that it was necessary to be kept, or it can be addressed in other form, the MPhil course which was there?
See, as I mentioned, I went for my MA at AUD, that's Ambedkar University in Delhi, which a lot of its MA programs were devised in a way that they could replace a research degree. So we have methods course, we had critical theory courses, and I'm talking about social sciences here broadly. But not all MA programs and not all universities are equipped to run, at least at this point, they are not equipped to run those kinds of courses. So for somebody who wants to get into research, they do need a sort of a bridge that sort of puts them, at ease when they actually eventually end up at PhD. So I don't know. I mean, for my own case, for somebody who studied at Ambedkar University, I don't think I needed an MPhil, but I still did it because I didn't get admission elsewhere. So, but not everybody sort of has the, because MA programs are also bombarded with a lot of other things. So if now the university, the current system is imagining these kinds of universities where there are teaching intensive, there are research intensive, these options could be sort of explored, where you have a certain time where and MPhil not just gives you the tools, methods and tools to write your dissertation. It also gives you that scope when you write a dissertation, like 100 or 200 pages dissertation. It also trains you in sustaining an argument for that long length. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I will be personally, if you ask me, I don't have any problems with scrapping MPhil, but that does not mean that everybody who has gone through an MA program at DU or at Goa University, for example, will be able to sort of cope up with directly going into PhD. So probably, if you're scrapping MPhil, what are you replacing it with? That remains the question. Are you replacing it with a bridge course or a MA that is more research intensive? I think that will answer the question that you have.
Okay. Thank you, Kaustubh. Nicely explained. Now we would welcome any attendees who would have any observation or questions to both our panelists or their independent observation on this. Yeah, Kaushal, you may go ahead.
Yeah, so first I'd like to thank Mrs. Manisha and
Kaushal, your voice is breaking.
Okay, how about now? Is it good now? Hello?
You may try removing your headphone if that is required.
Wait. Just change it. You can take some access questions as well. Wait.
Hello.
Yeah, it's better now.
Right. So first, I'd like to thank Mrs. Manisha and Kaustubh for giving such a comprehensive understanding of what the new education policy is. I'd just like to make a few points that I've noticed. One thing I'd like to talk about the fact that they've encouraged or they're pushing for a medium of instruction in vernacular wherever possible, at least till grade 5 or they're in grade 8 and beyond. And my point was this, because they've also mentioned in the new education policy is one thing of Ek Bharat, Shresth Bharat, where they basically tackle or take in languages and learn new things about the demography and geography of India and learn these small tidbits. So I think, why don't we make it more interactive? If you want to the sentiment to retain or protect this language from evaporating in a sea of English, instead of teaching children in the local dialect, maths and science, they can use that language and teach that language in some sort of form of arts, maybe drama, theater, or more interactive, where anyways it will be in tune with the culture and tradition. There'll be more things that people can learn, instead of just saying that medium of instruction should be in a vernacular dialect. So that's one point. And the other thing I wanted to say was the whole new education policy is an agenda for 2030. So the deadline that they have given of them accomplishing all these things is 2030 as per the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the goal number 4 that they have. This is in tune with that. The closest deadline that they have, I think, is of 2025, where they want to achieve foundational literacy and numeracy by the grade of 3rd grade. So these 2 points I just wanted to mention, and I would like both of you or any of you all to elaborate on any of these points. Thank you.
Ma'am, you would like to respond on this?
See, once again, that's why I told you that I am going to talk about the school sector and the higher education sector. And I would request, given your interest, you should have a couple more focused discussions now that we had the general overarching thing. Now, what has happened is that, and I did not touch it because of lack of time. In schools now, if you see the World Development Report, it's talking about the learning revolution. Now, the learning revolution is largely a revolution of testing. It is not about learning, right? Now, PISA, etc. PISA, Politics and Power is a very important work. I can't remember the author. It's there in my library right here. I'll probably send it to you on email later. I'm not as good as you guys are. You're sharing so much good literature in the chat box right here. And so the one important thing is that there is, see, structural adjustment, etc. It happened until the 1990s, even till 2000. Now the Indian state, along with the support of the middle classes, which are globalized and the benefits of neoliberalism have been reaped by them, the Indian state and the middle classes are asserting that make the schools global, right? Now, how do you do global schools? By testing. Now, what is the real research on testing? The real research on testing tells you that schools in Finland have topped the PISA tests. Why have they topped the PISA tests? One recipe only, because their teachers in schools have been as good as university lecturers and professors. So the story, What do you want to do? The world's largest testing population and testable child population is in India. So spend on testing. Keep saying child has not learned. What is the problem with the child? The problem with the child is exactly the child's problem is what has been shared with me by Aditya, Tejas Harad's piece. If the child comes from like Kaustubh Nayak, my mother was also a teacher. She had done 2 MAs at the Banaras Hindu University. But I studied with my grandmother in a rural village school. That was the only way my mother could learn. What is the first problem in class 3 that I had? I do not know any English. And let me be very honest to you, not knowing English is not simply about this thing about diversity and learning. No, it is degrading and subhuman. Because in grade 3, I did not know how to tell my teachers that I needed to go to the toilet. Every day in the morning while people were preparing for school, my mother was preparing me for the war called the classroom, where how I could ask for normal human rights for access to toilet or water. It could be a very fearful experience. Nobody in the class ever spoke to me, I remember, till the time that they realized that I was excelling in the knowledge domains. I didn't have the language domain. I could switch from Bhojpuri to Hindi, but the road from Bhojpuri to Hindi to English was a steep curve for me, very steep curve. So much as people say mathematics is hard, English was a tough thing for me. And today my only existence is in the language that did not allow me to access the barrier. I cannot even imagine that those who have entered the portals of schooling after me, what they would have gone through. I remember in the summer vacation when I went back home, it was a relaxed phase for me. That at least 2 months I don't have to speak in Hindi. I still remember cauliflower is called phool gobi in Hindi. Kaustubh, you will know because you've lived in Delhi. Hello? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, but I think your video is stuck.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
But
Video seems to have
Can you
frozen.
hear me? We've lost the connection, it seems.
Ma'am, I think we can hear you. Your video seems to have frozen.
Hello?
Yeah, you may continue,
Can
ma'am.
you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Can you hear me?
I think, okay. Ma'am has left the meeting because of some network issues. Kaustubh, you have anything to respond to Kaushal's question?
yeah, I think the policy does talk about making this whole experiential learning and whatever. But then again, what ma'am was highlighting in Finland, because the teachers are also trained at a level, school teachers are also trained at a level that university teachers are. It really here we'll see it really depends on how the teachers implement it. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine, this policy talks about arts integrated learning and whatever. A friend of mine, she's working with a school in Delhi.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I'll just continue and you can.
Yeah, please.
So she's working with a school in Delhi to work on the arts integration curriculum for them. And I think there was a module that she had to develop on.
Can you share her name with me? Do it on the chat box.
I will write. Yeah. So there was a module that she had to develop on tribal cultures, and the thing that she came up with was to teach the struggles of tribal communities through their protest songs, and then arrive at a certain understanding of tribal rights, forest rights, and whatever. And her colleague had a very immediate sort of a response to that. Ki, ma'am, ye kyun karna hai? Can't we just not teach them tribal jewelry banane ke liye nahi sikha sakte humko? See, these are like again two approaches. You can teach them about tribal culture through their very living, contemporary problems, or you can just museumize them and say ki Warli painting banayenge or jewelry sikhayenge. What is the idea of culture that we are really sort of propagating? Is it a museumized culture, or is it a culture that is present in today? That is what will define how these experiential learning things will be taught in school. I think when ma'am said that Finland, the teachers are like equipped as good as the university teachers. I think that's a good thing, and I think we should really think about how we train teachers here in that sense. Yeah, so that's
Kaustubh,
it.
let me tell you that CBSE and most private schools now take their principals, teachers to visit Finland. And Finland has also realized that the largest number of visitors are coming from Indian schools because obviously we have the largest child population of the world now. That's the demography we have. So Finland has started charging fees from these school trips. Now all these people go to these schools. The one lesson is that you have to invest in professional teachers. You have to invest in teacher training. Teacher training is not a skill like, you can teach them the playway method. Teacher training is something that has to be established in universities. That's a struggle we have had. Now, fortunately, this new education policy agrees that teacher training will be in universities. So there are times when I have to say that some tenets are there. Now, where are those tenets absent? Those tenets are absent precisely when you have pointed out that they go back to the golden age saying, oh, this university in the past in history was very good. Yes, it was very good. But is there a contemporary knowledge of the diversity of the Indian public university system? I have to be invited by the Goa University to learn about what Kadam was doing as chief minister. I go digging the earth to be able to, in the time that it has taken me to find out about the University of Mysore, in the time that it has taken me to find out about the Swadesha Abhimani as a newspaper and what it has been doing in public instruction in Malayalam, translating, etc. I could have written 5 peer-reviewed papers which could have given me API points, right? But the fact is that what we lack today is a dialogue and critical knowledge on our own public university system. This is how we can become underconfident people. We think India में university है ही नहीं. ये कैसे हो सकता है कि एक पूरे लोकतांत्रिक समाज में public sphere नहीं है? नहीं है तो सही, पर हम उसे engage कैसे करते हैं? Now you rightly spoke about the young colleague of yours who does art and poetry based education interventions. What was my big learning in Andhra Pradesh? If you read my book, I have given a lot of data, a lot of interviews, and my supervisor would keep telling me that keep doing your surveys, keep crunching data. The real reason why Andhra does better than Bihar is not in your data. And finally, when he asked me, what do you really think, Manisha? Let's keep your PhD aside. What are the real reasons? And you know what I told him was the real reason? That Andhra had been able to develop poetry in Telugu for its children. One of these poetries, Chitti Chilkamma, Amma Kutinda, was when all the children would stand. I learned that poetry by heart. And the girl would go hopping like a bird. And each child had become a mango tree. I learned later that Andhra had the biggest diversity of mangoes, and each child was a different variety of mango. So when I asked for Begum Palli and Baigan Palli, then one of the teachers sat me down and said, Madam, you are great, your knowledge is great. But this mango is not Began and Baigan that you're talking about. This is a North Indian way of describing it. It is called Bhangina Palli. Now, Bhangina Palli also referred to Tribhanga as a pose. Sure, it goes back. Now, if you look at the Odyssey torso, the torso moves slightly and the body can make a triangle in an aesthetic pose. And because the mango makes the triangle and the body can make that triangle, and which is also our classical carvings on our temples, now here was a great way in which every child in the class laughed. I mean, the joy of living with mangoes at a young age. Chitti Chilkamma, Amma Kutinda, the bird is going, pecking every mango. I would enter the schools and the greetings that I've had from children because I knew their poetry. And what was the reason the children in Bihar were not doing so well? Because the language was the biggest barrier. Somebody spoke in Magadhi, somebody spoke in Maithili. Maithili has immense poetry. Not one of those poets in Maithili are prescribed on the text. Bhojpuri, I've told you, the script has been stopped. And in my own school, for example, I still remember that in a science class, I saw the picture of a cauliflower on the board. I was dreaming. This was grade 8 in my English school in Patna. I was dreaming. So suddenly I saw it. Cauliflower is called Pulgobi in me. Now when I dream still in Bhojpuri. In Bhojpuri, it is called Kobi. Now, the moment I called it Kobi, I saw it and I said Kobi, this was a biology class going on. The entire class laughed at me. I still remember the gaggle of that laughter. I'd identified what it was, but the class laughed at me for calling it Kobi. And the teacher called me aside and said, stop calling it Kobi, call it Phul Gobi. So, language is not just diversity. It is not even identity. Language is thought, language is idea, language is being, language is freedom, language is a right to be. Now, when I speak this language today in Delhi, I'm told, oh, construction laborers speak this language. So finally, any pursuit of mine, it can be from a world-class university. It can be the best, highest ranked degree. I still go back to my supervisor, John Harris, and I tell him, John, I've gone to LSE, I've got a degree, I think I need to go to Harvard. And he looks back at me and he tells me, Manisha, you will not find peace there. Don't do this. Go back to your own people and be who they are. So where do I find my, not all pursuits are pursuits of power. Some pursuits are simply the pursuit for knowledge, simply the pursuit for the counterfactual, the true Karl-Popperian that I am. For us, any certainty exists only till the time we find the next thing that can falsify the rest. There's nothing certain. There's uncertain. There's poetry. There's dream. There's imagination. There's freedom. But most of all, the university is a site of egalitarianism. And I will congratulate Kaustubh by saying that when he spoke about the anxieties of cultural nationalism, and when he said a better citizen, let me tell you that Ritti Leupold's work that I'm reading right now, she is saying that policy reforms is a language, and that language is used by administrators. It is supported by the global neoliberal middle class. And when they use this language, and when they see the ordinary college in Kasaragod in Kerala, they find the students are protesting publics. Now, why are students protesting publics? These are first generation learners. They are coming here, they're coming together. In the Karl Meinheimian concept, a generation is being forged in Indian public universities. And this generation is learning the joys of egalitarianism in the site of the public university. For them, the public university is simultaneously a site for realizing democratic citizenship, right? So the state will have a discourse of policy reforms. The intellectuals will talk and engage with that discourse of policy reforms. The quotidian, everyday life of the public university is something that is held by you all, that is a tribute to you all. And you forge a generation of youth as you pass through the portals of the Indian public university. And as much as my pen will allow me, my job now is to be that wanderer of the Indian public university life, where I can interact with you students and understand how you are realizing the potential of democratic citizenship within the sphere of the public university in India. And I once again thank Ramrai, Kaustubh, all of you there. Please enlighten me, please teach me, please take me along as you go through the portals of your own higher education. We will talk more. I can talk to you about rankings, tell you how we can go on. The best ranked universities are those that have histories that are 400, 500 years old. Where are the histories of our public universities? So when poor becomes so poor, they don't even believe in their own history, in their own language, in their own culture. That is the poverty of knowledge, the poverty of language, poverty of thinking. Now maybe we can use this policy as the tool to say, let's think in our own languages. Let's engage. But let's engage with our diversity as the starting point. And I think that possibility is provided by the NEP.
Right. Ma'am, we are well past our time. So can I have your permission to extend the session for 10 more minutes?
Yeah, but just 10, because I do have to get to something else.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
please. Sure.
So we have some more questions.
Okay.
Elaine, can you ask your question? Elaine Priya Gupta.
Yeah, I think Elaine ma'am had an issue with the, not issue, she had a query to which I was replying. I think Elaine ma'am should go first. Thank you.
Ma'am, you can take your question, ma'am. Priya, ma'am.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I just had a very preliminary reading about the national education policy as being in a school teaching primary. It was circulated among the teachers. So I can't say that I have gone through it threadbare, to be very frank. But my issue was yes, the time frame is 2030. We understand that. Going by what we are doing right now, the online teaching, the complete change in pedagogy, the way we are imparting our education, the way the children are picking up, and how the teachers had to struggle to suddenly go from a classroom blackboard to making PPTs and presenting them on the electronic media. We have gone through a drastic change in a very short time. Having said that, I'll say that we have grown. In a way, we have all grown. My issue was that all these changes that we're thinking about at the grassroots level, my parents are still asking me, ma'am, what grade my child got. We've just gone through our first assessments, form-based assessments, Google Forms, all MCQs. Now, I need to know that until unless there's a complete change in the mindset from the users and the users being the stakeholders, the parents, the university admissions systems, where grades, marks, merit list are still sought after. I have my doubts about credit-based systems and how it's really going to pan out, starting from the school level. Right now, when our speaker was speaking, most of the discussions were for the higher education, I mean, university level education. About the schools, people are still slightly uncomfortable talking about it. So, my issues would be breaking it down for the school teachers. What are we supposed to do? That would be my main concern here. I think we're doing
Yeah.
a great job, everybody feels. But what? How do we get the direction from now on? See, we went from CCE back to mark-based system, and a complete hodgepodge resulted. We don't have retention till 8th, but then they start in 9th. I mean, what's going on?
Okay. A quick answer to that, Kostubar ma'am.
I think ma'am should go.
Okay, let me tell you this, that as long as the CBSE as a system will be controlled by bureaucrats, and as long as schools keep thinking that they are not a knowledge domain, but they are a sector that can be governed bureaucratically, issues of knowledge and assessment will not be taken together. I mean, the CCs, for example, I was addressing a conference of school teachers. I have left all my elitism and I go and address school teachers whenever I'm invited. Now, almost 16 districts in Eastern UP, the teachers had corrected there, and they told me the load of work that the CCE involved for them. They were continuously filling up forms. But do you think there is one research paper in India done by an academic on teaching time and what CCE has done? No, because it was only prayers and petitions going to CBSE, which has been for some time now being governed only by bureaucrats. It's a good posting. So bureaucratization is an issue. Max Weber writes about it. And he talks about professionalization. What does Finland tell you? Finland is telling professionalization. So you can have lofty ideas. But unless you try and understand assessment issues as academic issues, number one, you will keep saying grade stage, what this grade stage, etc., all been imagined by Plato in 5th century BC, not our inventions, telling us what should be done at this stage, that stage, formation of the mind, cognitive learning. Much advancements have happened since then. Dewey's schools, he spoke about U Chicago and Columbia. Dewey spent his life in Chicago forming the experimental schools, and his time in Columbia was spent on teacher education. Now, unless we first understand problems as research questions, the issues with CCE are not procedural issues, they are research questions. How do we assess? What do we assess? My understanding is that these questions will be boxed. Our move from one system to another will not be based on knowledge principles, and most of these assessments will be put aside in the name of multiple exit points. What we will start having is many forms of GRE, GMAT type standardized testings. Now in Hindi, I call it inti pinti papa tinti. Tick karo isko, tick karo usko. Now this multiple MCQ type testing, which can be read by optical readers, it's not a test of knowledge, right? And we were producing great knowledge. Dr. Radhakrishnan's class lectures, forget Radhakrishnan, another teacher called Hiriyanna, who knew nothing else except Sanskrit, philosophy and Kannada, did not know English. Rather, read Radhakrishna's writings on Hiriyanna, his colleague. So the fact is that the immersion in knowledge, even of the school system, is step number one. Assessment is a problem of knowledge. Assessment is a problem of critical learning, and there are many pathways to it. The Americans use standardized system, but every American university asks the entrant to write a statement of purpose, which is an essay. In the U Chicago, the entrants are decided by the student body. What is the nature of the peer community we will form? My best time in my life is when I read student essays trying to go to American universities. In our own universities, get your marks. As if marks is some form of validation. So people scam mark sheets, fake mark sheet, pure mark sheet, hologram mark sheet. Not required. Are there ways in which we can decide? So my understanding is that this multiple exit flexibility will largely encourage standardized testing. And even what we have right now will be replaced by optical reader based, very objective. Look at the shifts that happened in JNU. Everything is objective, everything is MCQ. What is MCQ? Nowhere in the world will a PhD admission be made on MCQ based entrance. Nowhere in the world. So on the one side, you want to make the world's best liberal university. On the other side, you want to control the format of testing. These will be, I'm not prejudging, and therefore I want to praise and commend the new education policy. But the lack of implementation of the idea of the public university, who will be the people who will battle it out? Then the poor student and the weak teacher. Then where will poetry go? When will I do my poetry? When will I get my fee? No, I will be ensconced in the battle to say, look, the new education policy said this, but actually you are encouraging great centralization and bureaucratization, this opening to foreign. If the best could be established in India, I would be very happy. But please revive the best that we have already. In the world, the story is highest ranking on world parameter are all old institutions, Harvard, this, that. There, they don't close their old institutions and set up new one as world class. Nowhere in the world are top universities, new universities, except in China. Do we want to become China? No, we are happy in our diversity. We are happy in our poverty. We are happy in the languages we speak. We are happy in our expressions. Fortunately for us, even our respected and honorable Prime Minister has said that China is not where we will look forward. So I will look forward to it, that our university reforms should not take the China path. We should become the transition from the English to the American. I mean, these are not problematic concepts. Whether we do it in 2 years or 4 years or 5 years, I mean, these are not problematic concepts. The issue is whether the argument has criticality or not. The university is about an argument. The university is about an idea. The best universities still are those that are remembered by what the public intellectuals did there, and the public intellectuals do these in a unity of teaching and research. The student is not a forgettable community. The student is not a transient community. The student is the lifeblood of a university. The student forges a generation and bond while they are in the university. That's what we have to emphasize.
Okay. Professor Rahul Tripathi, I would now request your intervention because ma'am also is saying that she will also have to leave very soon. Professor Tripathi, yeah.
Can I just thank ma'am for giving this wonderful lecture, ma'am. I would love to hear more from you. It's amazing. You're so radical in your views. You're so advanced. I'm really looking forward. I've never met a person like you, frankly, before. I'm an alumna of GU. I'm a student of GU, by the way. I was there many years back. These young students have started this forum. I congratulate them too. They won't know me. They're very junior. Thank you so much for your answer, ma'am. This is a burning issue which hits me every time I take an assessment for my children. What do I do? The population, the number of children in my class are huge. Going by each one's capability is difficult. These are things we'll need to work out very soon. Yes, it's a huge uphill task for all school teachers. Well, having said that, I think Elaine ma'am's question was very relevant. It doesn't have a simple yes or no answer. I know about primary elementary education in the mother tongue, but I feel that elementary is basically working with your own hands, life skills. I have been a preschool teacher myself. I'm Montessori trained, and that's why I'm telling you. And language did not stop me from holding a child and making him try out a spooning kind of activity or a sieving kind of an activity. So I really don't know whether it holds merit, but then it's open for discussion. So from my side, thank you so very much for being so informative, ma'am. It's amazing just hearing you speak. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Priya has actually given the vote of thanks, which I was supposed to. But Manisha, it has been really wonderful. I mean, we met.
Thank you, Rahulji, for remembering me. Thank you.
We met a couple of years back, and that day you had made a very impassioned plea that we must meet at Goa University. We could do it at that time, but I'm so happy that you could be with us today. So, Ramra, mine are not really interventions, but in just one line, what I would have liked to read more in the new education policy is the term interdisciplinary or interdisciplinarity. There is a lot of multidisciplinarity being talked about, but with the kind of current university system, college system we have, multidisciplinarity often ends up in a student from one department just taking 2 courses from the other department and not being able to make out what is the linkage. So interdisciplinarity is something which needs to be worked upon. Kaustubh, if you are anxious about the context in which the new education policy is coming up, yes, you have every reason to be. But then I'll tell you what the solution is. You should try to engage with the system, perhaps in a language which they understand. I'll just give you an example. Day after tomorrow, in the coming week, I'm supposed to speak at a college in Gorakhpur. And Gorakhpur, is a very prime location of national politics.
Yes.
Given its proximity to...
it's a national honor, Rahulji. It's a national honor to be invited to Gorakhpur.
And the college also happens to be the hub. Now, myself being from Gorakhpur, I have waited for 20 years for this opportunity. So the theme is India and her neighborhood. So it's quite, and they want the lecture to be in Hindi. So I have no problems, absolutely. Now I have to convey somehow that India's policy in the neighborhood has drastically failed. But how do you tell it in a manner in which you still don't ruffle the feathers? So it's a simple point. I mean, we know that Akhand Bharat cannot be a reality today, but Akhand Bharat still can be a reality if India and its neighborhood coexists in a paradigm of interconnectedness. So I say that if you really want to have an Akhand Bharat, well, better focus on the neighborhood, try to reclaim the neighborhood. So I think the best way to engage with those anxieties is, I think, people like you, people like us who are concerned about the way things are, we should enter into a politics of engagement and perhaps trying to explain things in a language which they understand. Ramrai, every time you take up a topic, you end up setting very high standards. And I would entirely agree with Priya that this has by far been one of the most engaging pinnacle discussions that we have ever had. So thank you very much, Manisha ji. मैं उम्मीद करता हूँ कि ये लास्ट टाइम नहीं है जब आप हमारे साथ अब हैं. I mean, you have created a lot of flutter already. मैंने कभी सुना नहीं कि वेबिनार में कोई किसी से कह रहा है कि I have never met a person like you. So that means there is already a connect that has happened. So thank you very much, Manisha ji. Thank you very much, Kaustubh. The advantage of having Kaustubh with us is that he now acts as a very strong connect between us in Goa and JNU, and now he will be a global citizen. So, I mean, he's the best ambassador of what local, national, and the global can be. So with these words, thank you very much again, all and all the participants who attended. And Pinnacle continues. We will continue to come up with very engaging themes. Ramrai, absolutely no issue if now we try to break this up into subgroups, maybe have a discussion specifically on school. So in that sense. So thank you very much, Ramrai. Last